Welcome to Minding Men. I'm your host, Brian Pollack, coming to you via Zoom during COVID-19. Today's guest is Kevin Gardner. He's a North Carolina native and graduate of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's a performing artist who's worked at the New York City Opera and has had the esteemed honor of working on the national tour of Rent. He's also worked with such amazing people such as John Legend, Sarah Bareilles, who tracked for some of their recordings, as well as recently making his debut at the Metropolitan Opera's 2019-2020 season of Porgy and Bess. Kevin, welcome to Minding Men.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to get right to it because we don't have all the
All right.
time in the world, and you and I prepared and talked a lot to this. What was it like growing up here in the United States, in North Carolina, as a black man?
It was very interesting. Obviously, being in the South, you have a lot of um, racial issues. It's the Bible Belt area, so obviously there's a lot of issues with, homosexuality and how men are portrayed as men, the masculinity of it all, making sure that you are taught how to be a man, how to exude yourself as a black man in this planet, on this earth, just as a means of just gaining respect. And yeah, it was very interesting, very, very, very difficult in terms
So,
of like really trying to find yourself.
so let's get into that, right? Because I know you have such a dynamic story all the way from growing up, all the way to being a part of the Metropolitan Opera, which I know has been a goal for you and you achieved it. So, where growing up did you figure out or learn how to be a guy and what masculinity looked like?
Well, growing up, I um, was pretty much surrounded predominantly by women. Um, all of my cousins are girls for the most part. I was always over my grandmother's house on the weekends, which also had my aunt as well as my cousin, also a girl. So I was always surrounded by girls. The only male figures that I had in my life were my father and my uncle. My father and I had a very interesting relationship where we were close, but not. Um, the, he instilled in me ways in how to be a man or learning about masculinity in different ways in terms of like being a provider. But my uncle, who I would probably characterize as a very militant black man, had a very different experience when it came to how to be a black man in this world. And so he and I would have multiple conversations when I was a kid, um, just about what his experience was growing up as a young black man in this country, going to war, moving to New York. And he lived here for, I think, 20 some odd years before moving back down to North Carolina. That was all before I was born. And yeah, he had very strong views about what it was like, what it's like being a black man in America and how to respond to that. So
Can you,
it was very interesting.
yeah, can you share? You used the word militant, and
Yeah.
that's a pretty strong word.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples of where? I mean, obviously he was in the military, but
Right.
what
Right.
type of militant viewpoints did he hold and try to have you also accept?
Well, he was an activist. He was a marcher. He was very involved in politics. He was very involved in um, uh, just the civil rights movement, the era. So my uncle was born in '43, I believe. So in his 20s, he was experiencing the height of the civil rights movement. So I mean, like and then obviously going to Vietnam after that. So it was just like all encompassing. So when he had just a very different view of society, of what it was like being a man, being a black man having to gain respect, what it looked like to have to gain respect, what steps he took to do that, and to make sure that um, you know, any of his people, his family, they knew what to expect in this world as they grew up, what to expect from white people, what to expect from their own people, and how to make sure that you really held your own, had your own stance in this country. So it was very much like be very, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Be very conscious of your surroundings, be very uh, not untrusting of white people, but leery. I mean, always err on the side of caution when it came to that. And yeah, so it was he was very, you know, don't take
Now,
no crap.
you're more of a modern man. You obviously didn't go to Vietnam. You weren't in any wars. You didn't
Right,
go to the military. In fact, you sing. You are expressive in who you are, which is
right,
a bit of an opposite of that, which is
right,
wonderful.
right, right.
At the same time, I'm a white man, and I'm okay to hear this, but I'm interested to know what is it about white society, particularly you were taught that we are untrustworthy, and what perceptions or what truths did you learn about us?
Well, okay. You're not even discussed this, but I've forgotten about it. But when I was a kid, there was a this is just a random section, just so you can kind of understand the gist of it. When I was a kid, there was a story growing up. Not really, it was a true story of a black man who was accused of raping this white woman, and it was in a park near my house, near my father's house when I was growing up. And this happened when I was like maybe 1 or 2 years old or something like that. It was very young. The guy who was accused of raping this white woman and killing her was 19. Uh, Ultimately, to make a long story short, he did not rape and or kill this woman. Had nothing to do with this woman. He spent maybe okay, he was already in jail by the time I was probably 2. And he didn't get out of jail. He wasn't exonerated for his crime or for the crime that he did not commit until I was well out of college. So he had spent the majority of his life in prison. His life was taken away from him. And it didn't matter how much information, how much evidence that was presented to the court. Every time it would be there were no fingerprints that matched. There were no nothing matched in the course of this crime. And no matter how much information any judge gave, and any counsel gave to judges in different courts as different courts moved from different courts to different courts, trying to get this man free, they just wouldn't accept it. And these were all white people. Um, uh, my uncle was very much a part of this particular movement of trying to free this man. And there's actually a Netflix documentary on it. Actually, check it out. I get you that information. And he's actually in the documentary too. You can see him in the background behind the lawyers. Yeah, he. It was very interesting. But needless to say, yeah, he didn't get free until I was out of college. Um, and yeah, so you spend a lot of your time. My mother's house, just to also keep it, uh, give you a picture. My parents' house in North Carolina, my mother's house, I should say, is literally 15 minutes away from Davidson County, and Davidson County is literally like the home of like the KKK for North Carolina. So it was very, in the midst of being surrounded by white people in my life. They were always my uncle specifically, and maybe my grandmother too. She had a whole different experience, but we're just very untrusting. So anytime I told them I had a white friend, they were like, uh-huh. Like, okay, but eventually I think it may have been even because of my growing up and my relationships with, some of my white male friends that maybe kind of broke that barrier a little bit, allowed them to trust people a little bit more.
So, speaking of breaking barriers and growing up during the time where you have a KKK community close to your home and there's all of this going on, and I'm sure this one conviction false conviction is just one example. Um,
Yeah,
Being a guy growing up,
yeah,
looking at all this, hearing your uncle, your
yeah,
grandmother, your mother, people everywhere. How do you make
yeah.
sense of all this for yourself as a black man in North Carolina trying to just be happy?
Um, it was very interesting. When I was a kid, my teacher uh, told my mother that I was getting too bored in class, and that I would start to distract the other kids. So my teacher brilliantly, instead of, I mean, she could have done multiple things with me, but she realized that it wasn't that I was just trying to be distracted. It was that I was bored, that I finished my work, and that my work was good. And so she basically told my mother that I think he needs to be challenged a little bit more. I think he needs to be in different classes. So she pulled me out of those classes and put me into other classes. And of course, these classes were filled with white people. So, and so, I had left, some of my friends and friends of color behind to go into higher learning classes where they were more likely just predominantly white, boys and girls. Um, and as any kid would do, you would create friendships and relationships with these people, because I wasn't, even though my uncle instilled in me all the things that he did, and we did have those conversations. I was living a different life, and I was in a different time, and so I took what he was saying, and always had it in the back of my mind, always had it in my back pocket. But I allowed myself to experience and get to know people that didn't look like me, people that didn't talk like me, people that didn't eat the same food that I ate. Um, and that just allowed me to grow, and become the individual that I am today. And um, yeah, yeah. I mean, allow myself to like just be me in that space, which was eye opening in the sense that that's when I started, doing things like joining choruses, and my mother put me in tap when I was a kid, and I don't know, I don't remember a thing about tap. I could barely do a box, and I could barely do any of that stuff. But yeah, so she started putting me in chorus, and I started singing, and I think that's probably when my love for singing kind of uh, um, came to fruition.
All right. So we'll get into that because I think that's a big hallmark of who you are. But you had mentioned one part of being in a classroom with a lot of or all white people, which I can
Yeah.
only imagine being a core identifier of self as a guy, as a young adolescent, possibly a smart one, which I think you are, and having to also have your uncle's information and teachings in your back pocket to me, call me, I don't know, maybe ignorant. It sounds like you had to hold that on as a way of safety and possibly some senses of stoicism, an ability to kind of hold on to your own while looking at everything and making sure that you aren't seen or done or looked at in any specific way and that it is a positive light. Is that fair to assume?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was always definitely in within reach, you know, just to try to make sure that I had stayed grounded and made sure that I was staying true to myself, and while still allowing myself to grow and experience new things and experience different friendships. When you um, and this friendships with guys and how that worked, and just learning to feel as comfortable in your skin as possible, but also being aware of the world, which I was very glad that my uncle did for me, um, because it allowed me to make sure that I was treated fairly and that I was, um, not discriminated against. And if that did happen, how was I to protect myself? Who was I to talk to? Who could I talk to? And yeah, it allowed me to just make sure that I stay connected. My family is a big family, and they are very interconnected. Even after my parents were divorced, which they divorced when I was 5, my mother and my father maintained an amazing relationship with each other. I think more so for the sake of me. But after my father passed, my mother I just started hearing a lot of stories from my father's side of the family about my mother, which I hadn't heard before. And so it kind of gave me a little bit more information as to why, um, even though my mother and my father were divorced, why they still remain such a tight knit family. My mother had weaved her way into my father's family life. So everybody on my father's side loved my mother, even after divorce. There was no animosity, no nothing. And it was just refreshing. It allowed me as a young child to kind of grow up in um, even though I was growing up in like in a dual household where I would spend the majority of my time with my mother, but I did have my father on the weekends or in the summer. It was like for months at a time or whatever. It was depending on how the situation worked. But yeah, I mean, it was very interesting. Yeah.
Let me jump in here because one of the things that we are minding men. We're talking about guys and mental health and understanding what it is. And you know, as my understanding of our talks before the show was that I think you were allowed actually in your community, in your family, to express yourself a little bit more than I would say most guys in our current culture allow themselves to, such as not always having to be so masculine or having to always
Yeah,
have
yeah.
power. Can, can you give us some examples of that and how possibly that helped catapult you as an adult male from your early years?
I think having being around women a lot in my life allowed me to learn how to um, communicate with them um, at a more understanding level as opposed to um, someone who only gets that kind of information or how to communicate with women from men. You know what I mean? So it's like if you are just surrounded by men and like all you know is from men.
Oh no, we seem to have lost Kevin. And one of the things that sometimes I must say is Zoom, it can be really tough when
that
some,
in
hey,
that
Kevin,
enabled me to do that. Yeah.
we're gonna have to back up one moment. I just kind of jumped in there because you froze. Not your fault, but the good
Okay.
thing is you're still here. So you were saying that being with women and how communicating with them and learning not so much of what the guys do, but really understanding communication seemed to be positive for you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was very positive for me. It definitely helped when it came to dating them. That would be for sure. And it allowed me to be able to have conversations with them in a way that seemed more natural and free flowing, as opposed to you know um, just this like pseudo masculine kind of like thing that funny enough that I would see a lot of my male friends do, and I would always be like, it's just really not gonna get you far, my bro. But you keep doing what you have to do. Eventually, there'll be some girl that'll crack on that. But
So we're talking more about how men viewed women, and because you were with
yeah,
women, you didn't have the same view because you saw them a little bit more as a compadre, a friend, somebody you can
yeah,
connect with.
yeah. Actually have like a real relationship, a real conversation with, as opposed to just like you know, BS conversations that really are that don't amount to anything, and just as much as like, hey babe, how you doing? It was just very, yeah, but yeah. So having these women in my life definitely allowed me to understand that aspect of it. My father um, didn't really, we really didn't talk about that. We really didn't talk about like relationships at all, actually, now that I think about it. We didn't talk about relationships, but I mean, he knew, who I dated. He knew who I was involved with in high school, in middle school, and, I didn't have any girlfriends in college. But, uh,
So can we get to that
yeah,
actually? If
yeah,
you're okay with this, I really want to get to that because it's so interesting. We're talking about women and how you connected with them and you learned about masculinity contexts of communication and emotional relating and all of that. And then you made this kind of shift personally in your own life at some
right,
point where women weren't exactly the priority anymore. Is
right.
that correct?
Yeah, I can say um, I've always felt like I've lived my life in terms of comfortability, what I felt comfortable with.
Mm.
And I would always ask myself before I went into anything, how comfortable do I feel doing this? How comfortable am I in my own skin doing this? When I am done doing this, will I feel okay with myself?
Mhm.
Not regretful. Um, and it's how I've led my life when it came to connections with people. And so there was a moment in my life when I was probably um, 16 or so. I had my first male experience with my best friend at the time, who was maybe 2 years older than me, I think, 2 or 3 years older than me. But we had known each other for ever, it seemed. But that was that was my first experience, and even then, looking back on it, at the time when it was actually happening, I asked myself, "Is this something that I feel comfortable doing?" And I felt connected to him, not in a like I love you way, but like just in terms of like a friendship way. That I could explore this as an option. And so I did. I felt comfortable with it. It was confusing, I'm not gonna lie, because I still had um, uh, interest in women. I still had an interest in pursuing more heterosexual relationships in my life. And I didn't know what that meant in terms of like how it connected to my masculinity. Was I more masculine because of this? Was I less masculine because of this? Um, yeah.
And, and may I ask too, I mean, particularly in the Black community,
Mm,
this idea of partnership, which is out of, let's say, normal contexts, I can imagine has a lot to do with how you view yourself and to use your own words, which, I as a white male don't say this to myself. Do I feel comfortable in my own skin? I've heard you say that a couple times now, which I wonder is if that's part of some of the upbringing of having to check in with yourself as a male and saying,
yeah.
am I okay in my own skin? Am I okay in my own self? Which is not something, again, that many people treat or teach themselves. So I want to
Right.
really point that out. We only have a few more minutes. And there's so much I want to ask you. So we covered a little bit over there, but let's do this real quick. You ready?
Yeah,
Speed
I'm ready.
round. How the
I got it.
heck did you get all the way to the Metropolitan Opera, singing on a stage in front of a lot of people?
After
So,
I graduated from college, I moved up here with hopes and dreams of becoming a chorus member of the Metropolitan Opera. I missed my deadline for submitting my audition, but I did submit my audition for the New York City Opera, in which I was a part of, and that was my first professional audition, my first professional gig. After being up here for maybe a little less than a year at a particular point, so I kept it moving through many things national tours of Broadway show, blah blah. And 2 years ago, um, um, I looked at this audition for the Met, and then it said in the bottom that they were auditioning for Porgy and Bess. And I was like, now at this point, I'd already auditioned like at least 2 times for the Met, and I didn't get anything. But this particular time, I was like, yeah, I think this might be my opportunity to audition again. So I submitted my audition, and in January of last year, 2019, is when I got the call that I had got the gig, and yeah, here I am. And so, thank you so much. Yeah, and so they did. We opened the season for the Met, for Porgy and Bess, for the 2019-2020 season. The show did so well that they ended up adding on 3 more additional shows, which is really kind of unheard of for the Met. And they've already scheduled it to be returning for the 2021-22 season as well.
So it's amazing. And with this cultural climate, if we can open up the doors to theater again, there's no doubt Porgy and Bess is extremely relevant and extremely important. And I cannot, to anyone watching this, recommend seeing Porgy and Bess at the Met, or if they do a simulcast, look out for it.
Yeah.
We only have a minute. So what I want to say is, I think, Kevin, you and I, we're starting a little bit of a Minding Men narrative series. This is going to be for you and me. I think we're going to talk a few times, because I think it's important to get to some of the stuff that has actually created contexts. And there's a whole story here. And there's a lot about who you are and your experiences as a man in America. And we need to keep that going. So I cannot thank you. And, we will see you here again. And for everybody watching Minding Men, thank you for joining us on Mainline Network. Kevin is the best. He has one of the most beautiful, amazing voices. Hopefully one day we'll be able to post some of his work on the Minding Men website at Mainline Network of some kind. And thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful, wonderful day, and be safe out there.